All right, good morning, guys. This review video is to help you all remember what we learned about in Unit 8. So this would have been the unit immediately before we switched to digital learning. It included industrialization with the Industrial Revolution and all of its effects, the growth of capitalism and communism as economic systems, nationalism with the unification of Germany, the Meiji Restoration, and of course, imperialism in Africa and in Asia. So let's work through the PowerPoint together. And we will get started. All right, so let's start with the Industrial Revolution. So if you're thinking back to the very end of February when we started this, the Industrial Revolution is the first time we start to see machines being used to produce everything. So the economy of England first, and then it spreads around the world, shifts from agriculture to manufacturing. Manufacturing is a new way in which things are produced, and they will be produced in factories made by machine instead of made by hand. And with the growth of these factories, people start moving to cities because that's where the factories are. So if you look at the maps right here on the right, this map on the left is in 1800, so about 50 years into the Industrial Revolution. There's a few big cities across Europe. By 1900, the number of cities has pretty much tripled, the number of large cities of 100,000 or more people. This is because now there's more factories and people have moved to where those factories are to get jobs, leading to the growth of the towns into cities that those factories were in. With the Industrial Revolution, it was a rough life. Working conditions were long. It wasn't uncommon to see 16-hour working days. Very hard and very dangerous. Children were working in these factories, as you can see in the picture on the bottom left. And it was not uncommon to have horrific injuries. So labor unions will be created to advocate, to speak up for those workers in the factories. They're trying to get better wages, better treatment, the concept of time off, shorter working hours. So all of this is part of the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution helps allow the next couple things to happen, because without the Industrial Revolution, those events may not have happened in the same way. So thinking about new economic systems. So capitalism and communism are the two dominant economic systems that are being written about and talked about during the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism was the economic system of the factory owners. Capital is a word that's sometimes used to mean money. So you have the capital to open a business. That's why they're called capitalists. It was written about initially by a guy named Adam Smith, who was a British guy. And he wrote about the idea of laissez-faire capitalism or laissez-faire economics. It's right here, the last bullet point under capitalism. This is the concept that the government keeps its hands and its fingers out of the economy. The idea that competition between business is a good thing because it will prompt businesses to create the best product possible for the lowest price in order to get the most customers. Communism, Karl Marx writes about this as a reaction to the negative effects that he sees within the factories. So he's writing about this as partly a reaction to the bad working conditions, the constant problems that factory workers are having. And Karl Marx writes a pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto. And it's in that he talks about the fact that the workers will eventually rise up or rebel against the factory owners, the capitalists, and try to divide resources equally by the people, not necessarily by the government and the elite, but by the people who are directly affected. And communism is appealing to factory workers because they want more equality. They want better treatment. They don't want to be working for 16 hours a day if they don't have to. Some of them never saw their families, pretty much. And a lot of the labor unions that we just talked about on the last slide that were advocating for the benefit of these factory workers, those labor unions often started talking about the communist and Marxist ideas, the idea of standing up for yourselves, that dividing resources equally and making things a little bit more fair would be better. After the Industrial Revolution, we start to see the growth of nationalist movements. Two of them that we talked about specifically are the German Unification, so the creation of the modern Germany, and the Meiji Restoration. So thinking back to the basic definition of nationalism, there's many facets of nationalism. We saw new facets when we got to World War I. But in this case, we're talking intense or extreme support for your nation, which often results in wanting to prove that your nation is more important or better than others. So German unification is an example of nationalism, because when Otto von Bismarck is trying to unify the German-speaking countries, he is doing this because he believes that they will be stronger and better together than they are separate. So Otto von Bismarck, he was from Prussia, which is, if you look at this map down here, it's this dark blue section of the original map. And he uses a policy of blood and iron. In other words, industrial power, warfare, and military strength to unify all these many, many different German-speaking countries into the bright yellow on the right side after unification of the modern country of Germany that we recognize today. The Meiji Restoration happens in Japan. If you think back to Unit 6 when we talked about the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan had moved into isolationism. Isolationism comes to an end in Japan now. And it ends after Commodore Matthew Perry, a U.S. naval officer, arrives in Japan and forces Japan to start trading with the U.S. again. So with the restoration, it is restoring the emperor to power. So this is the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, and they put the emperor back in power. So Emperor Meiji gets his power. Isolationism in Japan comes to an end, and Japan rapidly, and I'm talking within the space of 10 years, begins to industrialize, westernize, change itself to be a little bit more like Western European nations, and begin its own process of industrialization and eventually imperialism to catch up to, as much as possible, these Western European nations. Speaking of imperialism, we're going to look at it from 2 points of view, Africa and China, Asia, because the motives were slightly different. Within Africa, the biggest motives were to get natural resources to send back to the factories in Europe to be made into goods, and a desire to make money off of these natural resources that were being exploited out of Africa. To divide Africa up into the colonies that you see on the left-hand side map, this is done through the Berlin Conference. And it was essentially a grab bag meeting of European nations. So this political cartoon on the right depicts that, shows that a little bit. Basically, the European nations at the Berlin Conference split Africa up into colonies. They decide to do whatever they want. It's partly based on who already had a trading presence or who may have had a military presence there. But the European nations completely ignore existing African kingdoms and tribes. These African kingdoms and tribes and ethnic groups are seen as irrelevant by these European powers. And they divide Africa up into colonies that will remain colonies pretty much until World War I. A few start getting some independence, but definitely the major decolonization movement won't be till after World War II. So it'll be about 150 years or so of colonization. after the Berlin Conference. And within these African colonies, the European powers take complete control. They have direct influence over the politics, the economics. They can pretty much do what they want under the rules that they put into place. South Africa, for example, had gold and diamonds that were coveted by the British. They wanted them very badly. And this will lead to actual wars being fought over the territory by the British in order to get and keep control of those natural resources. In Asia, it's just a little bit different. European nations are still looking to make money, but they're looking to do this for expanding their trade routes and getting a place to sell, a market to sell the finished products that they had made in their factories. India was considered the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. It had oodles of natural resources. It had people that could be used as a labor source and to buy products. And it was used to produce cash crops like cotton and indigo for the British Empire. It was controlled by the British East India Company first, and then after the Indian Revolt of 1857, the British government takes direct control. China was a little bit different. China was divided into spheres of influence. And I'm actually going to show you a map of that on the next page, next slide after this. Basically, the spheres of influence in China were economic zones that were controlled by different European nations. So within those spheres of influence, a European nation would have total control over the economy and trade policies, but pretty much leave the official governing to China. Chinese people and the Chinese government were not thrilled with the policies and goods that had been brought into China by Europeans. The Qing dynasty had a policy of isolationism. They thought they were fine on their own, that they didn't need Europeans. To get a foothold into China, the British were selling opium. It was making them a lot of money. Opium's a drug, so people would get addicted to it. The Qing rulers attempted to stop the British from selling opium. The British refused to stop. It was making them tons of money. Why would they stop? China ended up fighting the Opium Wars with Britain and lost badly, which led to more European control within China, and it ended up giving Britain control of the city of Hong Kong. The Boxer Rebellion was another attempted resistance to European control in the Chinese regions, northern China. It failed miserably as well, and after that we will see more European control. So motives, of course, are money, mainly natural resources in Africa, and of course, expanding trade routes and markets in Asia. But the people being colonized did not go quietly. A lot of times, yes, they went along with whatever was going on because they didn't want to die. They wanted to live and do as best they could. Some examples of resistance to European imperialism included the Boer Wars in South Africa, which were fought for control of South Africa after the discovery of gold and diamonds. The Indian Revolt, the Sepoy Mutiny in India. With the Sepoy Mutiny, there was a shift in the way that the British troops were treating the sepoys, the Indian soldiers, and also rumors that the new ammunition being sent down would include either pig or cow fat and skin with it. And that is a no-go for Hindus and Muslims, which were the majority of the sepoys. They were Hindu or Muslim, major religions in India. So they revolt against the British. After about a year, that revolt is violently suppressed by the British military. The Boxer Rebellion in China takes place up here if you look at the map, the blue outlined section. Qing rulers in China trying to get rid of British control. And of course, the Opium Wars also trying to remove British control, stop the sale of the drug of opium to the Chinese population. All of these resistance movements are similar for a couple ways. The European powers were violating the local customs, local traditions, and active abuse of the native populations, whether it was by taking advantage of them, forcing them to only work in certain areas that would be beneficial to the European colonial powers, or simply ignoring the cultural aspects that existed within native populations. All of these resistance movements were unsuccessful. None of them had the effect of removing British or European control. In fact, after all of them, we will see more European control and influence. The Qing dynasty in China comes to an end, a violent final end. After the Boxer Rebellion, India will remain under British control for another 100 years. And within South Africa, it'll be another 50 to 60 years, almost to 100 in some cases, of European influence and control. All right, so this is a quick, brief overview of European imperialism. If you are struggling with anything, please reach out to your teacher. Come to the 1 p.m. meet session. If you look on your teacher's e-class pages, the link should still be there to get your questions answered, to talk through information that you're working on understanding. More than likely, your teachers still have anything that was put on e-class prior to digital learning that you can go back and reference as well. I hope you all have a great day. Good luck on everything, and have a wonderful afternoon.